Hello, beautiful people. It's Dr. Mika Stewart, and I'm here to teach you about classical theory. When you're trying to decide upon a place in which to live, most people on the hunt for a house take into account several factors. Now, for those of us living in Southern California, where the traffic is always bad, a key consideration has to do with our commute. How far do we want to be to a good quality school, if we have kids? How long do we want to be in the car driving to work every day? And how close is too close when it comes to family? Another key factor that people take into account is the crime rate of a particular area. This makes sense if you think about it, because who wants to live in a neighborhood in which crime is rampant and the likelihood of being a victim of crime is high? I know I don't. I would guess that you probably don't either. I mean, who would choose to live in a crowded housing complex in which murders were frequent, weapons could be found lying around on the ground, and police helicopters are flying at all hours of the night looking for suspects? Why live in a neighborhood like that if you had the option of living in a beautiful, spacious, gated community staffed with a gun-carrying guard who was paid to keep the criminal element out? The unfortunate truth is that most people can't afford to live in such luxury, and for them, the reality of crime is ever present. The sentiment of not wanting to live where crime is high and personal safety is low is not something unique to you, me, or even our time. Crime is dysfunctional for societies in that it destabilizes communities and can interfere with healthy functioning of our major social institutions. It interferes with the functioning of our family, of education, of religion, of the economy, of government, of healthcare, and of the mass media. Now, politicians spend a lot of time trying to get voters to vote for them by talking about being tough on crime, even though those tough on crime policies don't work, as we shall see below. So, in order to stop crime in its tracks, we have to know what causes people to commit crimes in the first place. Therefore, the two key questions that criminologists seek to answer are as follows. What causes crime? What can be done to prevent or reduce crime? People often rely on theories when they want to understand or explain why, when, where, or how something occurs. Okay, so what is a theory? According to the Open Education Sociology Dictionary, a theory is a coherent set of ideas that explains observed facts or phenomena. From ancient times to the Middle Ages, societies relied heavily on religious theories to explain everything from natural disasters to physical illnesses. Earthquakes were not the result of seismic shifts beneath the earth. They were a sign that God was angry with people. The Black Death, a plague that killed over a third of the European population in the 14th and 15th centuries, wasn't understood by the masses to be a result of the spreading of germs and bacteria, but was rather explained by the Catholic Church to be a result of the spreading of human sin. In the medieval period, religious theories were also used to explain norm-violating behavior. During this time, people blamed God and demons for criminal and deviant acts. It wasn't that people made rational choices for their behavior. Rather, it was believed that people were under the influence. No, not that kind of influence. Rather, under the influence of both good and bad supernatural forces beyond their control. For example, if a person engaged in some type of deviant behavior or speech, it wasn't uncommon for people to believe that God was using that person to warn others to get in line with God's will. Just as John the Baptist is cited in the Bible as a rather odd fella who wore strange clothes, ate locusts, and ran around shouting for people to repent and be saved through baptism. Deviant individuals who weren't considered to be led by God were thought to be led by the devil. Demonological theories, theories which assert that a person who commits a crime is possessed by an evil spirit, were popular and widespread during the medieval period. These demonological theories were at the heart of the persecution of people as witches. During the height of the European witch craze, about the 15th to the 17th centuries, if a person, particularly a woman, had a mole, a birthmark, or other quote-unquote suspicious markings on her body, it was likely to be viewed as the devil's mark, one that signified that she was a witch. Exodus 22 and 18 of the King James Version of the Bible states the following: "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." In this context, the word suffer means allow. So this Bible verse is saying that witches should not be allowed to live. As a result, hundreds of thousands of women who were accused and then found guilty of witchcraft were executed by the Catholic Church. Before executing someone, however, their guilt or innocence had to be proven by a trial. No, not a trial like our contemporary trials with lawyers and judges and juries. No. The types of trials in medieval Europe were more like extreme tests designed to prove guilt or innocence. One popular test or trial was the test of ordeal. In these trials by ordeal, the accused would be subjected to a difficult, actually nearly impossible assessment that would cause bodily harm and sometimes even death. The belief, however, was that if the person was innocent, God would either protect them from harm or miraculously heal them if they were injured. One popular trial by ordeal was for a person to reach into a fire. Okay, now listen to this. Reach into a fire and take hold of a smoldering piece of iron. Are you kidding me? The person then had to walk 3 to 5 paces holding the iron. If the person's hand didn't burn or blister, or if the burns or blisters were healed within a short period of time, usually about 3 days, then the person was considered innocent. People accused of being witches often had to endure a trial by ordeal that involves water. The accused was tied into a fetal position and then dropped into a cold body of water, such as a lake. Because water was viewed as pure, the thought was that the water would accept anyone who was also pure, that is, innocent. But the water would reject anyone impure or guilty. Thus, if the accused floated, that meant that the water rejected them and they were guilty. However, if the accused sank, then the water was accepting them, and that meant that they were innocent. Now, on the surface, this looks pretty much like a lose-lose deal. Because if you floated, you would get executed, probably hung or maybe burned at the stake. But if you sank, you could also end up dead, obviously, because that would mean that you drowned. To prevent the death of those whom God, through the revelation of the water, had deemed innocent, the accused would be fished out of the water, ideally before death or brain damage occurred due to the lack of oxygen. Okay, now as I mentioned above, If a person was found guilty as a result of their trial by ordeal, they faced extremely harsh punishments. They might get crushed to death by huge boulders like this unfortunate soul in this picture, who's lying down and several large boulders are being placed on top of him until he dies. Now, if they didn't get crushed by the boulders, they might experience beatings, blinding, beheading, and boiling, just to name a few. Now, I can make a list of the types of torture used as punishment during the medieval ages, but I think a brief video can capture the horrors of this era much better. However, before we proceed, I must warn you that some of the scenes you are about to experience are unnerving. Therefore, viewer discretion is advised. And we're back. Whew! That was rough. I don't know about you, but watching a video like this is just yet another reason I am so thankful that I was born in the 20th century and no sooner. Okay, so why was punishment so harsh in medieval Europe and other parts of the world? Let's look at 4 main reasons. First, the prevailing sentiment of the time was that the best deterrent to crime was to make the consequences of committing a criminal act so severe that people would be too afraid to deviate from the rules. Secondly, there were no police to enforce law and order, and those with power, those who were in the numeric minority, were afraid of uprisings and revolts by the poor, who were in the numeric majority. So the harsh consequences for crime were seen by those in power as a necessary form of social control. Okay, along with there being no police, there were also no prisons. Well, there were some, but there were very few. The use of prisons as punishment didn't develop until the 19th century, and during most of the medieval period, it was considered quicker and cheaper to kill or maim than to hold and maintain people in jail. The 4th reason punishments were so harsh was to encourage people to confess. The unconfessed sinners were bound for hell, so the Roman Catholic Church encouraged the use of harsh punishments to get people to confess their sins and be saved from everlasting torment in the next world by enduring a brief torment in this world. Well, if you're going to send people through all that they sent people through, you have to ask, how effective was it? Not very. Okay, so yes, certainly people were deterred from committing crime in order to avoid the harsh punishments. But as a whole, the humiliation, torture, and execution of those who violated the norms was not effective in not effective in preventing crime, not committing crime. As a result, new thoughts about the cause of crime and new ideas about ways to prevent crime began to emerge at the dawning of the historical period known in the West as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment took place from the late 17th century to the early 18th century and was an intellectual movement in which philosophers and other scholars began to develop new ideas about God and human nature. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason because during this period, people began to rely more on science and reason than on tradition and religion in order to explain human behavior and natural phenomena. It was during the Enlightenment that a young Italian philosopher known as Cesare Beccaria emerged on the scene, bringing what were considered at the time radical ideas about crime and punishment. In 1764, at the still young age of 30, Beccaria wrote a treatise titled On Crime and Punishment. Because Beccaria feared retaliation for challenging many of the ideas and customs associated with law and order in Europe as a whole, and Italy, his homeland in particular, he first published his treatise anonymously and only put his name on the work after it was received positively by the government. The Catholic Church, however, remained strongly opposed to his essay and had it on their blacklist for 200 years. Seriously? Okay, so you've got to be wondering, just what were these radical ideas that got everybody so riled up, or at least the church? Well, these ideas brought about reform in much of Europe and greatly influenced the development of the criminal justice system in the United States. It is said that his work was read by the founding fathers and was influential in the creation of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. 4 of his radical ideas are as follows. Punishment should not be tortuous. Punishment should not be torturous. Number 2, reasoning and free will influence human behavior. Number 3, there are more effective ways to prevent crime. And number 4, the criminal justice system should be fair. Now, these are radical ideas, that there should be fairness and humanity and reason. Wow. But that was the era in which he lived. So let's now look at each of these 4 ideas in a more in-depth manner. As we review these, be thinking about which of Beccaria's ideas you agree with or don't agree with, because that just might be one of our next discussion questions. Okay, Beccaria had a lot to say about punishment and torture. Here are a few of them. The state does not have the right to kill or torture, especially when the torture's primary goal is to elicit a confession. Even innocent people will confess to crimes they didn't commit in order to stop the torture. The purpose of punishment is not to only cause pain, vengeance, but to preserve public safety by deterring the offender and others from repeating or engaging in the deviant behavior. And 3, and this is one of the ones that he is really, really known for, and that is that the severity of punishment should match the severity of the offense. Anything in excess of this is unnecessary violence perpetrated by the government against its citizens. Okay, so those were for point 1. Number 2. In number 2, we take a look at Beccaria's thoughts about reason and free will to determine if they are indeed reasonable. Let's take a look. People aren't controlled by gods and demons. Rather, people have free will and are influenced by their own desire for pleasure, what he called the pleasure principle. Before breaking the law in order to pursue personal pleasures, people do a cost-benefit analysis in order to rationally decide if it is reasonable to commit the crime. If the cost of committing a crime, meaning the punishments for the crime, outweigh the benefit of committing the crime, reasonable people will make the rational choice to refrain from criminal behavior. Yeah, these seem pretty reasonable to me. So let's move to his 3rd point. and see what he has to say. Let's see what he has to say about the prevention of crime. Okay. It is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. Now, this quote is taken directly from Beccaria's essay on crime and punishment, and it demonstrates that he is very much in favor of a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. The death penalty is not effective in preventing crime. The pain is only momentary. Now, I don't know about you, but as I was watching that video on medieval punishments, I was thinking about how if I had lived in that time and was to be executed, I would have prayed that they would just chop off my head with the guillotine and get it over. None of this putting me on the rack or crushing me with rocks or letting rats eat out my intestines. I mean, again, those things were just amazingly horrific. All right, the next point. The certainty and swiftness of a punishment, not the severity of it, deters crime. So in other words, knowing that you will be punished, not that you might be punished, but that you will be punished, and knowing that the punishment will come very soon, is what deters people from committing crime. His next point. Education is more effective than punishment and torture in preventing crime. Now again, this man lived, like almost 300 years ago, and we still don't seem to have this point down because we spend so much money on incarceration when the fact of the matter is that the cost to educate people is significantly less than the cost to imprison them. And the payoffs to society as a whole are so much greater. So, of course, as an educator, I love this point. Beccaria strongly believed that any criminal justice system should actually have the pursuit of justice as its core. Wow, what an idea. In so many ways, this man was already in line. He was greatly in line with the social justice principles we've been exploring in this class. Okay, so now, given that he was a lawyer and a highly educated man, he had privilege that he used to call out injustice. Beccaria was strongly opposed to those with privilege, those with class privilege, meaning those in the upper classes, getting special treatment. Again, we've talked about this. He believed that there should be equal punishment for equal offenses. A poor person should not get a harsher sentence than a rich person who commits the same crime. Where is the justice in that? He also said laws should be written and made public so that citizens know their rights and responsibility. Accusations, trials, sentencing, and punishment should all be done publicly to ensure fairness and transparency. And 5, I guess that's 4. 4, judges should apply the law, not create it. Now, this was of great importance to Beccaria because at that time it wasn't uncommon for the magistrates or the judges to decide on their own what the crime was and what the offense should be. Not surprisingly, many judges favored those in their class, making this a good example of what we talked about the conflict view. Remember, we had 2 views about what goes into the making of crime, the making of laws. We had the consensus view, which said that laws were made based on the general consensus of the people. And then we had the conflict view, which said that laws were made to protect the interest of those in the power, the elite positions. So this is just an example of that. The judges were making laws and making rules and applying them in ways that benefited them and those in their circle. Okay, let's make a little transition and talk a minute about Beccaria's personal life. Now, by all accounts, he seemed to be doing well. Again, we just established that this was a privileged man. I mean, he had family, he had friends, he had a remarkable education, a career as a lawyer, and once he actually put his name on his book that he first published anonymously, he had popularity. He had many things going for him. And there was one other thing that he had as well. He had a mental disorder. Now, the literature doesn't give it a name other than to say that Beccaria would have these experiences of extreme melancholy, lethargy, and depression, followed by an elevated mood of either anger or enthusiasm, and in which he would have all of this energy. Those are the traits of bipolar disorder. Now, I'm not sure if it was bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 because it's not clear as to just how elevated his highs would be, but it definitely sounds like his lows were really low. So why do I mention this? I mention it because here is a man who may have at times felt so low that he just didn't want to go on anymore. And yet, despite the debilitating disease of depression, he was still able to be so powerfully influential that the ideas in his writing are still relevant today. Anybody else out there with a little depression that makes you think that maybe you won't have anything to contribute? That's not true. Depression lies, feelings lie, and I'm really glad that Beccaria didn't listen and let the world be deprived of the great work that he ended up producing. And I wonder what great works are in each of you. Okay, let's move on and begin to discuss Beccaria's friend, partner in crime, so to speak, or I guess partner in crime fighting, Jeremy Bentham. Now, Jeremy Bentham was born in 1748 and died in 1832 at the very old age of 84. 84 is old in our time, but in the early 19th century, it was amazingly old, considering that people had a much shorter life span. Okay, so Jeremy Bentham, or JB, as I'm going to call him, was a contemporary of Beccaria's and a co-philosopher of the classical school. JB believed people were guided by a hedonistic calculus: maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Understanding this calculus helps establish appropriate punishments. JB's writings impacted English criminal law and helped shape development of the first modern police force in London in 1829. JB was also one of the first to conceive of the idea of using jails for punishment. Although the idea really didn't catch on during his time, as I mentioned above, by the late 19th century, jails were being used for punishment. The idea spread, and now imprisonment is one of the most widely used forms of punishment around the world. Now, I'm not trying to make this sound like it's a good thing per se, but I suppose prison is better than disembowelment. Okay, let's move forward and take a quick look at some of the critiques of classical theory. With its emphasis on people's behavior being a product of free will, the classical school ignored the forces outside and inside an individual that could lead to crime. Auguste Comte suggested that forces beyond a person's control determine human behavior. Now, if you remember from your intro to sociology class, if you have taken that, Auguste Comte is considered to be the founder of the discipline of sociology. And then we have the man who we just studied, C. Wright Mills, who introduced us to the sociological imagination. And C. Wright Mills, he provides examples of why what we do is not just about our choices, given that there are actually structural constraints that people face. Okay, I think it's time to sum it up. In this presentation, we explored the development of classical theory as a tool to answer two questions: what causes crime, and what can be done to prevent crime. We took a trip to the past, a rather scary trip to the past, and we learned that during the Middle Ages, people attributed crime to supernatural forces, and that both the government and the church meted out harsh sentences, torture really, for even the slightest infraction as a way of deterring people from committing crime. We then saw how with the dawn of the Enlightenment, new ideas brought forth by Cesare Beccaria and our boy JB, Jeremy Bentham, challenged the prevailing ideas by saying that it wasn't supernatural forces that led people into crime. It was rational choices. Beccaria and Bentham also had quite a bit to say about the excessive use of violence on those accused of committing a crime. Their ideas are the foundation of classical theory and have been influential all over the world, especially in the United States. Although much applauded for their insights, radical ideas, and commitment to justice, one critique of their work is that it presumes that we are all free agents, making choices solely on the basis of what's rational, and not in any way constrained by forces beyond our control. Whew, all right, beautiful people, it is time to conclude our study of classical theory. I hope this presentation has given you a greater understanding of what is considered one of the earliest criminological theories used to explain crime.